I never expected that a once-in-a-decade rainstorm would change my life, but that's exactly what happened. For a long time, my world was a small, predictable loop. I'd wake up, make coffee, and sit at the desk in the corner of my living room to write. My name is Miles, and my job as a freelance copywriter meant my apartment wasn't just my home. It was my office, my cafeteria, and my entire universe on most days. It was a quiet existence, and I thought I was content with it. I had my routine, my books, the soft glow of my computer screen. It was safe. But safe can be another word for lonely, can't it? My apartment was on the second floor of a charming but slightly decrepit building, the kind with stubborn windows and pipes that groaned in the winter. The best feature was the view of the central courtyard, a small patch of green that served as the building's heart. It was from this window, my perch above the world, that I first really noticed him. Caleb. He lived in the unit directly across the courtyard from me, 2B to my 2A. He was, in a word, vibrant. While my life was lived in shades of quiet gray, his seemed to be a series of bold, primary colors. He was a search and rescue volunteer, a fact I'd pieced together from the heavy-duty gear I'd see him loading into his truck and the occasional snippet of conversation I'd overhear in the hallway. He was always in motion, leaving before dawn with a thermos in hand or returning after dark, his face smudged with dirt, but always with a kind of weary satisfaction in his eyes. He had broad shoulders and strong hands, the kind that looked like they knew how to fix things, how to build things, how to hold on tight. I watched him from a distance, of course. Our interactions were limited to the standard neighborly nods and the occasional, "Hey, how's it going?" exchanged while getting the mail. He had a smile that was quick and genuine, crinkling the corners of his eyes. And every time he offered it to me, my stomach would do this little flip, a brief, dizzying lurch that I'd immediately push down. Because Caleb was the kind of guy you saw in magazines about the great outdoors. Confident, capable, ruggedly handsome. He was the kind of guy who, I was absolutely certain, went home to a girlfriend who was just as adventurous and effortlessly beautiful as he was. He existed in a different world, one of mountains and forests and real-world heroics. My world was one of deadlines, grammar rules, and the precise temperature for brewing the perfect cup of tea. He was completely and utterly unattainable. So I observed. I learned the rhythm of his life from my window. I knew he was an early riser, that he drank his coffee on his small balcony every morning, rain or shine. I knew he sometimes struggled with the lock on his front door, jiggling the key with a quiet, frustrated sigh. I knew he had a small collection of succulents on his windowsill that he tended to with surprising gentleness. These were the tiny, mundane details I collected, like little stones I'd put in my pocket. They were meaningless, I told myself. Just the idle observations of a man who spent too much time alone. But they made him feel a little more real, a little closer, even from across the courtyard. My life was measured in word counts and project briefs. His was measured in miles hiked and lives saved. The distance between us felt as vast and uncrossable as the canyons he probably rappelled down on weekends. I resigned myself to this fact. He would be the handsome neighbor, a brief, pleasant part of my scenery, and nothing more. I was fine with that. Or at least, I told myself I was. That's how life works sometimes, isn't it? You build walls around your heart to keep it safe, and you learn to call the enclosure contentment. Then came the storm. It wasn't just rain. It was a deluge, a biblical torrent that seemed determined to wash the city off the map. The news called it a 100-year storm, and for once, the hyperbole felt earned. Rain hammered against my windows, and the wind howled like a wounded animal. The old building groaned under the assault. I spent the evening curled on my sofa, a blanket pulled up to my chin, listening to the symphony of the storm and feeling grateful for the simple fact of having a warm, dry place to be. I had no idea that just across the courtyard, someone else's sanctuary was failing. The knock on my door came late, sometime after 10. It was a tentative sound at first, almost lost in the roar of the wind and rain. Then it came again, louder this time, more insistent. My heart gave a little jump. No one ever came to my door, especially not this late, and certainly not in the middle of a monsoon. I padded across the living room, my bare feet cold on the hardwood floor, and peered through the peephole. And there he was, Caleb. He was soaked to the skin, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, water dripping from his chin. He had a backpack slung over one shoulder, and he was hugging himself, shivering. But it was the look on his face that stopped my breath. The usual confidence was gone, replaced by a raw, stressed-out vulnerability I had never seen before. He looked lost. I fumbled with the locks and pulled the door open. The wind immediately tried to tear it from my hand, sending a spray of cold rain into my apartment. "Caleb, is everything okay?" He looked up, and his eyes, usually so bright and alert, were just tired. "Hey, Miles. Sorry to bother you so late. I have a bit of a problem." He gestured vaguely back towards his apartment. "The roof. I think the old patch over my unit finally gave up. My ceiling is, well, it's currently becoming my floor." "Oh my God," I said, the words coming out in a rush. "Are you okay? Is it bad?" He managed a weak, self-deprecating laugh. "It's not great. The landlord's phone is just going straight to voicemail. It's pretty much unlivable in there for now." He shifted his weight, and I realized he was probably freezing. He wouldn't quite meet my eyes, looking instead at a spot on the floor just past my feet. It was the first time I'd ever seen him look uncertain. "Look," he said, his voice hesitant. "This is a huge ask, and please, feel free to say no, but all the hotels around here are booked solid because of the storm. I was wondering, would it be okay if I just crashed on your couch? Just for tonight. Maybe tomorrow. Until I can figure something out." My brain short-circuited. Caleb. In my apartment. On my couch. The idea was so far outside the realm of possibility that I couldn't process it. My safe, quiet, predictable world was about to be invaded by the one person who made my pulse race. Hope and terror waged a silent, frantic war in my chest. But looking at him standing there, soaked and miserable and vulnerable, there was only one possible answer. "Of course," I heard myself say, my voice sounding surprisingly calm. "Don't be ridiculous. Get in here before you catch pneumonia." I stepped back and held the door wider, and as he stepped over my threshold, bringing the scent of rain and cold air with him, I knew my quiet little loop had just been irrevocably broken. The first hour was a blur of frantic, awkward activity. I handed Caleb the fluffiest towel I owned and pointed him toward the bathroom, telling him to take a hot shower to warm up. While he was in there, I raced around my apartment, tidying things that didn't need tidying, plumping cushions that were already plump, and trying to make my small space look less like the hermitage of a reclusive writer and more like the home of a normal human being. I found a spare set of sweatpants and an old t-shirt, laying them on the couch for him. They'd probably be too small, but it was better than nothing. When he emerged from the bathroom, steam billowing out behind him, he looked infinitely better. His hair was damp and tousled, and he was wrapped in my towel. He saw the clothes I'd left out and gave me a grateful smile that made my stomach flutter. "Thanks, Miles. Seriously, you're a lifesaver." He disappeared into the bathroom again for a moment to change, and when he came back out, he was dressed in my clothes. The sweatpants were a little short, ending a few inches above his ankles, and the t-shirt was snug across his chest and shoulders. Seeing him in my things, standing in the middle of my living room, felt surreal. It was an intimacy I was completely unprepared for. I made us both some tea, my hands shaking slightly as I poured the hot water. We sat at my small kitchen table, the storm still raging outside, the silence inside punctuated only by the clinking of our mugs. The awkwardness was a physical presence in the room, a third person sitting between us. I had no idea what to say. My mind, usually filled with words, was completely blank. He was the one who broke the silence. "So," he said, looking around the room, "this is where the magic happens, huh? You're a writer, right?" I was surprised he knew. "Yeah, copywriter mostly. Ads, websites, that kind of thing." "How did you know?" He shrugged, a small, almost shy gesture. "I see you at your window sometimes. You're always staring so intently at your screen. Figured you were either a writer or a day trader." "You seem too nice to be a day trader," he said it with a little smile. And just like that, some of the tension eased. We started to talk. Really talk, for the first time. I asked him about his search and rescue work, and he told me stories that were both terrifying and humbling. He spoke not with bravado, but with a deep, quiet respect for the mountains and for the people he helped. He downplayed his own courage, focusing instead on the teamwork and the training. It was clear he loved it, that it was more than a job or a hobby, it was a calling. Then he asked about me, and to my surprise, I found myself opening up. I told him about the frustrations and small victories of working for myself, about my love for old books, about the ridiculousness of trying to craft the perfect sentence to sell soap. He listened. He didn't just wait for his turn to talk. He actually listened, his eyes focused on me, nodding along, asking thoughtful questions. The confident, unapproachable hero I'd built up in my mind began to dissolve, replaced by someone much more real. Someone kind and attentive, and a little bit lonely, maybe. As the night wore on, he showed me a different side of himself. At one point, he pulled his phone out, not to scroll mindlessly, but to show me something. "This is kind of what I'm trying to capture," he said, his voice softer now. He showed me a gallery of photos he'd taken on his hikes, sweeping vistas, close-ups of ice crystals on a pine needle, the way the light hit a rock face at sunset. They were beautiful, but then he swiped to another folder. It was filled with sketches, delicate, intricate pencil drawings of the same landscapes. They were incredible. "You drew these?" I asked, stunned. "Caleb, these are amazing." He ducked his head, a faint blush rising on his cheeks. "It's just a hobby. Helps me decompress. You know, after a tough call. It helps me focus on the quiet parts of the mountain, not just the chaotic ones." This was his vulnerability, the hidden artistic soul beneath the rugged exterior. This was the part of him that felt accessible. It was a revelation that sent a fresh wave of hope crashing through my carefully constructed defenses. Later, as I was getting him a pillow and a blanket for the couch, I was grabbing a glass of water from the kitchen. He came up behind me to put his empty mug in the sink. The space was small, and he misjudged the distance, bumping into me slightly as he reached for the faucet. His hand brushed against mine. It was nothing, a fleeting, accidental contact. But it was electric. A jolt went straight up my arm and settled deep in my chest. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. He mumbled an apology, his eyes not quite meeting mine. And in that small, significant moment, I felt the air between us change. It wasn't just my imagination. Something had shifted. The space was no longer just awkward, it was charged. The power went out around midnight. One moment the room was filled with the soft, yellow light of my reading lamp, and the next, we were plunged into an absolute, disorienting darkness. The roar of the storm outside seemed to grow louder, filling the sudden silence. I heard Caleb take a sharp breath in the dark. "Well," he said, his voice sounding unnaturally close. "That's just perfect, isn't it?" I fumbled for my phone on the counter, my fingers clumsy in the dark. After a few seconds, I managed to turn on the flashlight, casting a narrow, dancing beam of light across the room. It landed on Caleb, who was standing just a few feet away, his expression a mixture of amusement and resignation. The single light source threw his face into sharp relief, carving shadows under his cheekbones. "I have candles," I said, my voice a little shaky. "Somewhere." We spent the next 10 minutes on a clumsy treasure hunt, my phone's beam cutting through the darkness as we searched my cupboards for candles and a lighter. The simple task became an odd sort of adventure, our hands occasionally brushing as we reached for the same cabinet door, our laughter echoing in the small, dark space. The forced proximity and shared goal stripped away the last of the awkwardness, replacing it with an easy, comfortable camaraderie. We ended up on the sofa, a cluster of 3 vanilla-scented candles on the coffee table casting a warm, flickering glow around us. It was cozier, more intimate, than the electric light had ever been. The apartment felt smaller, like our own private cave sheltered from the raging storm. We sat for a while without speaking, just listening to the rain lash against the windows. The chill of the unheated apartment was starting to seep in. I was wearing a big, fleece-lined hoodie, my favorite comfort item, and I pulled my arms inside, hugging myself for warmth. I noticed Caleb shiver beside me, rubbing his arms. "Are you cold?" I asked. "I can get you another blanket." "I'm okay," he said, but his teeth chattered slightly as he spoke. Without thinking, purely on instinct, I started to pull my hoodie off. "Here, take this. It's really warm. You need it more than I do." He put a hand on my arm to stop me, his fingers warm against my skin even through the fabric. "No, Miles, it's yours. I'm fine." And then, something happened. I don't know what prompted it. Maybe it was the strange intimacy of the candlelight, or the feeling of being the only 2 people awake in a sleeping world, or the simple, undeniable pull that had been growing between us all evening. He looked at me, his gaze intense in the wavering light. He didn't let go of my arm. Instead, he did something completely unexpected. He shifted closer, so our knees were touching. His eyes never left mine. Or, he said, his voice barely a whisper, we could share. Before I could process what he meant, he moved. He didn't take the hoodie from me. Instead, he slipped his arms into the front of it, burrowing into the space between the fleece and my own t-shirt. He was so close I could feel the warmth of his body, smell the clean scent of my soap on his skin. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, wild rhythm. And then, he reached up, took the edges of the oversized hood, and pulled it forward, over both of our heads. Suddenly, we were in our own world. A tiny, dark, canvas tent. The candlelight was gone, the room was gone, the storm was gone. There was only the sound of our breathing, mingling in the small space. His face was inches from mine, so close I could see the flicker of the candlelight reflected in his pupils. His warm breath ghosted across my lips. This was it. This was the turning point. The air was thick with everything we hadn't said, with the tension that had been building since he'd knocked on my door. He met my eyes in the near darkness, and his gaze was a question. And in that moment, sheltered together inside my hoodie, I knew my answer was yes. Without a single word, he leaned in the final inch, and his lips, soft and hesitant, met mine. The kiss was brief, tentative. It was more a question than a statement. A gentle pressing of lips that sent a shockwave through my entire system. It ended as quickly as it began, and he pulled back just enough to look at me, his expression unreadable in the deep shadows of the hood. Neither of us spoke. We just stayed there for a long moment, our foreheads almost touching, breathing each other's air, wrapped in the shared warmth of my hoodie. The world outside didn't exist. There was only this small, fragile, perfect moment of connection. Eventually, he pulled away, gently extricating himself from the hoodie and moving back to his side of the couch. The sudden loss of his warmth was jarring, leaving my skin feeling cold. He didn't look at me. He just stared at the flickering candles on the coffee table, his jaw tight. The silence that fell between us was completely different from the comfortable, quiet we'd shared before. This was a heavy, loaded silence, thick with uncertainty and 1,000 unspoken things. I should probably try to get some sleep, he mumbled, still not looking at me. It's late. Yeah, I agreed, my voice sounding distant and thin. Good idea. He laid down on the couch, pulling the blanket up to his chin and turning his back to me. I sat there for a few more minutes, my mind racing, replaying the moment in the hoodie over and over again. Then I blew out the candles and retreated to my own room, closing the door softly behind me. I lay in my bed, staring up at the dark ceiling, listening to the rain and the sound of another person breathing in my living room. Sleep felt like an impossible dream. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a bright, crisp sky and the sound of dripping water. But inside my apartment, the atmosphere was still thick and murky. I woke up after a restless night, my head filled with a jumble of hope and dread. I walked into the living room, and Caleb was already awake, sitting on the edge of the couch, scrolling through his phone. He had folded the blanket neatly and placed it on the cushion beside him. "Morning," I said, and the words sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He looked up, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Hey." The power's back on, he seemed determined to act as if nothing had happened. There was a new carefulness to his movements, a distance he placed between us that hadn't been there before. The easy camaraderie of the night before was gone, replaced by a profound and painful awkwardness. I made coffee, and we drank it in near silence, offering up bland pleasantries about the weather. Every moment was excruciating. I was analyzing everything. The way he wouldn't meet my gaze for more than a second. The way he held his mug with 2 hands, as if anchoring himself. Was he regretting it? Was he embarrassed? Or worse, was it just a weird, impulsive thing for him, a product of the strange, isolated circumstances, something that meant nothing? My internal monologue was a relentless cycle of self-doubt. I had to have read the signals wrong. The intensity, the vulnerability, the kiss. Maybe I had projected all of it. Maybe he was straight, and in a moment of stress and confusion, he just acted out. The thought was mortifying. I felt a flush of shame creep up my neck. I had allowed myself a moment of hope, and now I was paying the price. Fear of rejection was a cold, heavy weight in my stomach. He was going to leave, and things would be even more awkward between us than they were before. The friendly neighbor across the hall would become the guy I had to actively avoid in the hallway for the rest of my lease. After he finished his coffee, he stood up. Well, I should probably go check on the damage at my place. See if I can get a hold of the landlord again. He grabbed the backpack he'd brought with him. Thanks again for everything, Miles. You really saved me last night. His words were polite, but they felt like a dismissal. An ending. This was it. He was leaving. All I could do was nod. Yeah, no problem. I hope it's not too bad over there. He walked to the door and paused with his hand on the knob. He looked back at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of that same vulnerability from the night before. It looked like he wanted to say something else, but he didn't. He just gave me a small, tight-lipped nod and walked out, closing the door behind him. The click of the latch echoed in the silence of my apartment. I stood there in the middle of my living room, feeling more alone than I had before he'd ever knocked on my door. I spent the next few hours in a state of anxious paralysis. I tried to work, but the words on my screen swam before my eyes, meaningless. Every creak in the hallway, every footstep on the stairs, made my head snap up, my heart leaping with a desperate, foolish hope that it was him, coming back to explain. I replayed the hoodie moment 100 times, dissecting every detail. The look in his eyes, the hesitation in the kiss, the sudden withdrawal afterwards. It was a puzzle with a million possible solutions, and every single one I came up with ended in my own humiliation. I was catastrophizing, imagining him telling his friends about the weird, lonely rider across the hall who totally misread the situation. I was already planning my escape route from the building to avoid ever running into him again. The hope that had bloomed so brightly in the candlelight had withered into a thorny knot of anxiety. I had been vulnerable, and now I was just waiting for the pain. It was so much easier to stay in my safe, quiet loop, where the only person who could hurt me was myself. Just as I was sinking to the lowest point of my self-pitying spiral, there was a knock on the door. It was a firm, deliberate sound. My blood ran cold. It had to be him. I didn't want to answer. I wanted to pretend I wasn't home, to crawl under my blankets and wait for this whole thing to be a distant memory. But my body moved on its own, carrying me to the door as if pulled by an invisible string. I took a deep breath, braced myself for the final, crushing blow of rejection, and opened it. It was Caleb. He hadn't gone to his apartment. He was still wearing my clothes. He stood there on my doorstep, his hands shoved into the pockets of my sweatpants, his expression serious. He looked just as nervous as I felt. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice quiet. "We need to talk." I just nodded, unable to speak, and stepped aside to let him in. He walked past me and stood in the center of the living room, the same spot where he'd stood just last night, looking so lost. He turned to face me, and this time, he met my eyes and held my gaze. "I'm sorry," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "I'm so sorry about this morning. I was an idiot. I panicked. I just stared at him, confused." "Panicked? About what?" He took a deep breath, like a diver preparing to plunge into cold water. "About last night. About us." He ran a hand through his damp hair, a gesture of pure frustration. "Look, Miles, I have to be honest with you about something. The leak in my apartment, it's real. The ceiling is a mess. But I could have stayed with a friend. I have a buddy who lives 10 minutes from here. He offered me his spare room as soon as I called him." My heart sank. So it was all a lie. He had used me. The thought was a fresh, sharp pain. But he kept talking, his words tumbling over each other as if he was afraid to stop. I didn't stay with him because I didn't want to. I wanted to stay here. I wanted an excuse to talk to you. I've been trying to work up the nerve to ask you out for months. Months. Every time I'd see you in the hall or at your window, I'd tell myself, today's the day, and then I'd just freeze. I'd give you that stupid little wave and walk away, kicking myself. He let out a humorless laugh. "You see me with all my gear, and you probably think I'm this brave, confident guy. And I am, when I'm on a mountain. I know what to do there. But with this, with you, I'm terrified. You're quiet and smart, and you have this gentle way about you. And I had no idea if you were even interested. So when the storm hit and my ceiling started leaking, I saw it as a sign. A stupid, dramatic sign. I thought, if I could just spend some time with you, Maybe I could figure out how to say what I wanted to say. He finally paused, looking at me, his eyes pleading. And then last night happened. And it was more than I even hoped for. But it was real, and that scared me even more. So this morning, I panicked. I fell back into my old habit of running away. I'm so sorry I made you feel awkward or confused. I stood there, speechless, processing his confession. He hadn't been rejecting me. He'd been afraid. Just as afraid as I was. All the anxiety, all the self-doubt that had been churning inside me for hours, simply evaporated, replaced by a wave of dizzying, overwhelming relief. I found my voice. You thought I was gentle? I asked, a small, shaky laugh escaping my lips. A real smile finally broke through his worried expression. Yeah, I did. I do. Caleb, I said, taking a step closer to him. I've spent the last year watching you from my window, thinking you were the most amazing person I'd ever seen, and that you were so far out of my league you might as well have been on another planet. It was his turn to look stunned. You what? Last night wasn't just you, I said, my voice growing stronger, more confident. When you kissed me, that was everything I'd been secretly hoping for. The space between us was gone. I don't know who moved first. It didn't matter. His hands came up to cup my face, and mine rested on his waist, on the soft fabric of my own t-shirt. So, he whispered, his forehead resting against mine. Just to be clear, I didn't mess this up. No, I whispered back. You didn't mess this up. And then he kissed me again. This time, there was no hesitation. It wasn't a question. It was an answer. It was confident and sure, a mutual acknowledgement of everything that had been simmering just beneath the surface. It was the start of something real, born from a storm and a leaky roof and a moment of shared, terrifying vulnerability. The weeks that followed the storm felt like waking up from a long, quiet dream. My world, once so small and contained, suddenly expanded to include another person in the most wonderful way. Caleb's apartment took a while to repair, so he ended up staying with me for almost 2 weeks. My couch became his, but he rarely slept on it. Most nights, he ended up in my bed, and we'd talk for hours in the dark, learning the landscapes of each other's pasts. We went on our first official date to a little Italian restaurant a few blocks away. It felt both completely normal and utterly magical. We held hands across the table, and he told me more about his sketching, about his dream of one day illustrating a book about the local trails. I told him about the novel I'd always wanted to write, but had been too afraid to start. He didn't just listen. He encouraged me, making me feel like it wasn't just a silly dream, but a real possibility. His world of mountains and my world of words began to merge. He took me on a hike, a gentle one he promised. He pointed out different types of birds and trees, and I saw the landscape through his eyes for the first time, not as an intimidating wilderness, but as something beautiful and full of stories. I, in turn, introduced him to my favorite quiet corners of the city, a dusty used bookstore, a tiny independent movie theater. He fit into my world as seamlessly as I was beginning to fit into his. A few months later, we were standing in my living room, surrounded by cardboard boxes. But this time they weren't his. They were ours. We had decided to find a new place together, one that belonged to both of us from the very beginning. As I was taping up a box of books, I saw him across the room. He was wearing my old, fleece-lined hoodie, the one that had become a silent symbol of our beginning. It was worn and familiar, and it had never looked better. He caught me looking and smiled, that same genuine, heart-stopping smile that had first captivated me from across the courtyard. He walked over and wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. We stood there for a moment, just looking at the life we were building together, box by box. You know, he said softly, his voice a warm rumble against my ear. I'm really glad my ceiling caved in. I laughed and leaned back against his chest, feeling the familiar comfort of the hoodie. Me too. Life is a funny thing, isn't it? You can spend so much time building walls to keep yourself safe, carefully curating a life of quiet predictability. You think you're content, but you don't realize that on the other side of that wall, there might be someone just as scared as you are, waiting for a sign, for a storm, for a reason to knock on your door. All it takes is one moment of vulnerability, one decision to let someone in from the rain, and suddenly, you're not just safe anymore. You're home.